So now Nadab and Abihu, so to get to 10:1-3, why this important? What we see is an act of violation which is somewhat unclear. The act of violation has to deal with an offering that is made by fire. And yet we also had offering by fires earlier. So we have an offering by fire that resulted in immediate talionic punishment, immediate talionic death. And then, of course, then we have a speech that Moses gave from Yahweh. So Yahweh spoke to Moses, and it's a revelatory speech. And then after that, of course, we have the disposal of the bodies. But again, the importance of it is that these are the two sons of Aaron the high priest. He's got 4 total, and these are the first 2.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical text. I'm your host, Jared Thomason. Today's guest is Ryan Chester, and I'm going to announce it here because I think I left it out in the actual interview. We're going to be discussing his Journal of Biblical Literature article, The Jurisprudential Significance of Asher, a case study in Leviticus 10:1-3. There's a lot to be learned, and today's a lot of grammar talk. I do try to conceptualize some things in frames that I think might be helpful, and some of those fall flat, but that's okay because I'm trying to learn. So I appreciate Ryan Chester sitting down with me. It was kind of fun to find out in our correspondence. He, I guess, used to be a neighbor of Chris Tillings. So yeah, had nice things to say about Chris, which is a good way to endear yourself to me. I don't want to take up too much time on the intro. If you haven't subscribed already, wherever you're listening, please do. Leave a rating, leave comments, whatever it is that you want to do. If you want to go one step farther, follow the podcast on social media to get a good idea of what's going on. Every time I interview someone, I go ahead and post a clip on social media so that you can see, hey, there's this new guest coming out. Also, that's a great way to engage. You can also shoot me an email at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com, all one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Or you can become a Patreon supporter for $5 a month and get episodes 10 days early. I don't really have much other than that here on the front end. I will be back after the interview to set up next week's episode. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Ryan Chester. Ryan Chester, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Let's see, about myself. I'm a Hebrew scholar. I got my PhD a few years ago from King's College London, and an MDiv from Phoenix Seminary before that. So I've had a real passion for biblical studies just in general, and have just really enjoyed exploring more about God's Word. I mean, it's a very personal thing for me, but it's also an intellectually enjoyable thing to me. It's a union of both intellectual adventure as well as a practice of faith. So, and I really enjoy that.
I can feel that nexus of personal and intellectual. So Arizona to the UK, and then presumably back to Arizona?
Back to Arizona, yes.
Okay. What was that transition geographically like?
Well, that was actually a journey. It is interesting. When you come from the United States, you're going to the UK. You all speak the same language, but the cultural difference is so. It is more than I expected culturally. I was not expecting to be so shocked by the extremity of the difference, and it wasn't a bad shock. It was just a shock. So just the way of doing social interactions, in the culture over here in the United States is a lot more customer centric. For example, And in the UK, it's not as customer centric as in general. But what's interesting is what I found. One of the takeaways: relationships are more valued there in general than they are here in the United States. So it's just learning these different nuances of culture, going in and immersing myself in the culture over there, and then coming back here. It really builds great perspective on um, just how we are as people, how we relate to other people in various different environments, and I guess how we ought to adapt as well, and really strive to understand how other people are, what leads people to behave in the way that they do, and grow from that. It's really all about growing in maturity.
I think just as a baseline, we're a very commercial culture to begin
Yeah.
with, and that there's no, it's not a I guess a judgment of whether that's right or wrong. It just is that way here in America, that
Mhm.
commerce is how we ended up over here from Europe, and so it kind of persisted. Okay,
Mhm.
I won't digress anymore about that because that's not why we're here. We're here to discuss your article, your Journal of Biblical Literature article, the jurisprudential significance of asher, a
Mhm.
case study in Leviticus 10, 1 through 3. Did I say that correct?
Yeah.
Asher?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so starting off, can you walk us through Leviticus 10, 1 through 3? Why is this an important passage from Hebrew Bible?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me go into the background of this, of Leviticus 10, if you would. Um, in Leviticus, 1 through 7 is a lot about the different sacrificial procedures. In Leviticus 8, though, and on to into 10, we find a very different section. It moves from the practices of offerings, and for various reasons, into the ordination in chapter 8, which is a 7-day period of the priesthood. So the priesthood is now been being ordained to become the priesthood that God has chosen. And in chapter 9, we start the very first day, on the very first eighth of the eighth day. So this is the eighth day that proceeds into chapter 10, and many say into chapter 11, etc. This is the eighth day ordination rite, or rather the induction or inauguration of the priesthood. So in chapter 8, we have the first 7 days, and then in chapter 9, we have that induction and the inauguration in the priesthood. And so within that, what we find is now they've been set apart. They have been ordained to become officials of the priesthood. Now in chapter 9 and in 10, they are officials of the priesthood, and they can perform these functions. But there are certain boundaries and rules about who can do what and the timings of things. But what we notice in chapter 9 is that the kavod, the glory of Yahweh, is seen in two occurrences. It's towards the beginning, I believe it's in verse 6, and then in verse 23. So right at the end, the kavod of Yahweh, the glory of Yahweh, the glory of the Lord, as we'd have it in our translations, is appears. And we see the appearances of fire in verse 23. So right after that, this is still in the eighth day of chapter 9. We now have a scene focusing rather from requirements, it's more for the action. So now, Nadab and Abihu, so to get to 10, 1 to 3, why is this important now? What we see is an act of violation which is somewhat unclear. The act of violation has to deal with an offering that is made by fire. And yet we also had offering by fires earlier. So we have an offering by fire that resulted in immediate talionic punishment, immediate talionic death. And then, of course, then we have a speech that Moses gave from Yahweh. So Yahweh spoke to Moses, and it's a revelatory speech. And then after that, of course, we have the disposal of the bodies. But again, the importance of it is that these are the two sons of Aaron the high priest. He's got four total, and these are the first two. Okay, so these they have been ordained in chapter 8. they have now been inducted and inaugurated in chapter 9, the beginning of the 8th day. And now they do something that is wrong. They're punished. And by that, Yahweh gives a declaration and makes an announcement. So that kind of sets the context of what's going on in 10:1 through 3, and but also sets the context of what's going on, because they are still in the middle of their induction, their inauguration day, the 8th day. And the eight is important because that represents like a new beginning. So the 8th day is a very important day of a new beginning. And what we find here is a new beginning, and already in that day of new beginning, there's a problem.
Okay. So a share appears where? Because I know I'm thinking, and I'm looking at the verses as you have them from the BHQ, your new translation, and then NRSV.
Mm-hmm.
I think in English. I
Okay.
don't know Hebrew.
Sure.
So where, to my eyes, to most listeners' eyes, is a share appearing here?
Okay, so I have in the NRSV in here, right? And in the NRSV, we have in verse 1, we have the phrase, and they offered unholy fire before the Lord. So it's towards the end of the verse, and then we read, such as he had not commanded them. Such as would be the word asher in translation. So that's the NRSV. In other versions, it's which he had not commanded them, which is the relative pronoun. So the word asher is called a particle of relation, but it's often communicated as a relative pronoun. So in the NASB, it's used as a relative pronoun, and which is most often the case. Which or that is the most often translation for this section. So that's the first occurrence here. And the second occurrence is in verse 3. And the word is translated. So you have Moses speaking to Aaron, communicating what the Lord said. And then what the Lord said is then he said, this is what the Lord meant when he said. The word what is what is often translated from the word asher. So that would be in the NRSV version. So there's two occurrences, and the particle it's a particle of relation. What that means is, on its own, it doesn't mean anything really. It means what the context is pointing to. You need something else in order to understand what that word means. So a particle is a lot like a preposition. You know, if you have a preposition on its own, like in, the word in, I-N, if you have a preposition on its own, you're always like, okay, in what? What is in? You know, you need something else. So that's the particle. It is always dependent upon another word or words to give it basic meaning, maybe not precision meaning, but just basic and understanding where it can go.
Okay, so your translation offers when he had not, as opposed to the NRSV's such as he had not.
Yes.
So substantively, I mean, they're both kind of, there's negative space there that Adonai, the Lord, had not commanded them to function this way. They're supposed to function as directed. They functioned as otherwise directed. So, like, substantively, it seems like those two translations are saying the same thing. Is that not the case?
No, it's not the case.
Okay.
So there's a couple of things going on with the NRSV. First of all, there's a comma before it. So one of the things that often happens in translations is there's no or little explanation in the use of punctuation. You have to understand that Hebrew is an unpunctuated language. Biblical Hebrew is unpunctuated. Rabbinic literature has pointings which indicate punctuation, accentuation, and cadence, but that is a translation, So when you go back to final form, you're looking at consonantal text only with no punctuation. So when you have something that has punctuation in it, you have to ask the question then, okay, why punctuation? Why is that important? And so that's where restrictivity and non-restrictivity come into play. So what the NRSV, first of all, is saying that this is an interesting but not necessary element. So the entire phrase, such as he had not commanded them, is interesting and it's helpful, but it's not necessary
Okay.
by the fact of that comma that comes before it.
So, and this is one of the tricky things about translation,
Mm-hmm.
and I know this has come up on past episodes, and so I remember my friend Daniel, and I brought this up in interviews I've done with him explaining to me like 20 years ago or so, uh, rojo doesn't mean red. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, well, yeah. And he's like, no, rojo and red will refer to the same color, but rojo means rojo, red means red. And
Mm-hmm.
you may render rojo as red when you're translating. So this seems to go a little bit deeper in that when you put a comma in the English, you're trying to reflect the idea. So not you, but the NRSV translators here are trying to reflect their understanding of the message that's being conveyed.
Right.
You disagree with that, and you
Mm-hmm.
don't have that comma
Mm-hmm.
there. I think also though, I was looking as you were talking. I'm trying to listen, but I'm also trying to stay a little bit ahead in verse 3. So then Moses said, "This is what the Lord meant when He said," as opposed. So yours is then Moses said to Aaron, "He Adonai herein declared."
Mm-hmm.
That's another difference there, right? And a
Yes.
share appears there as well, right?
Yes. And yes, and that is another difference, a sher devar. So has herein declared, so spoke. So, I mean, some people will translate as spoke, some people will say that said, that kind of thing. But the word asher is what I'm dealing with here. And in this case, this is also different because what you have is translations creating multiple clauses that are not in the Hebrew. And so when the NRSV goes, this is what the Lord meant when he said, what I found is everyone that I did research on, and you can see the footnotes in there, uh, they they added in this particular phrase two prominent types of additions, which was turning the phrase into a combination of two types of existential clauses. So in other words, they expanded the text as they're trying to draw out how is this word, and this particular asher, the uses of it actually is confusing because of the who that's in front of it, which I discuss in the article. Is when you have a fronted who, how do you handle that? And so there's multiple different ways of handling that. But if I can, I want to jump back to what you were talking about as far as words and translations. Most oftentimes, what we focus on is the meaning of the word in translation, and we focus on the nouns or the verbs, right? The substantives and the verbs, the actions. Oftentimes, we ignore the particles. We'll focus more on the prepositions, but we'll focus less on the particles of relation, because they're almost like it's everywhere. I mean, almost 3,000 a share in the Hebrew Bible. It's all over the place. So, but at the same time, here's an issue, and this is a very true linguistic issue, is that there is rarely a one-to-one conversion or one-to-one meaning for a given word in one language that converts equally to a word in another language, as you were saying, rojo, red, right? That rojo means rojo and red means red. You're right. Now we translate that red, but rojo can also have nuances of shading in it too, right? Which is culturally dependent upon the context. And so while we often focus on those kinds of things to discuss, we oftentimes ignore the syntactic relation and the punctuated form necessary to communicate as authentic as we can the contextual milieu that's being communicated in the literature. It's easy to do that because it's commonplace, and our mind wants to focus on the attractive words, like the big thing in this entire passage is here is what actually is the violation. So what kind of fire, what is this? Is it incense? Is it coal? Is it ash? What is it? And that's where the majority of the debate goes to, is on that noun. What is those actions? Rather than the sequence of information, the context as a whole, what is it communicating? And then the punctuation that is needed to convey that. Does that make sense?
It does. And okay, a few things in there.
Sure.
The I guess I'll throw a couple of things out there, and we can come back to. So I think the more important one, because it's in the title of your article, is jurisprudential. So how do we get to the jurisprudential aspect? But then, so when you say we, I'm thinking, and I scroll down in the article. So there's just this beginning of this sentence on page 45. In 1915, Carl Gansel, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correct, explained that. So that caught my attention right away in 1915.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to like cast my understanding of the development of like Hebrew scholarship backward. And I'm like, oh, I don't really have much. I don't know much. I wonder how much of this was scholars feeling around and trying to figure these things out, to where you're still building work on particles that are, I mean, it's like statistically it appears a lot throughout the Hebrew Bible, so you would think it would get a lot of attention, but it sounds like it doesn't. But so I guess we'll just jump back to the jurisprudential thing. How do we get to the jurisprudential aspect of your article?
Okay, well, that's actually been, first of all, this section is widely understood as an aspect of law. Okay, so what is law? Law is a category of jurisprudence. So therefore, the jurisprudence. The issue, though, the difference between law and jurisprudence is that law conveys the idea of the contemporary idea of that which is legislatable, whereas jurisprudence conveys the idea of the philosophy that undergirds what may or may not go into law. Does that make sense?
Kind of. I have some thoughts, but I want to hear you flesh that out a
Sure.
little bit more if you have more.
Sure. What's interesting is that, so in using terminology that we can identify with today, and at the same time communicates what's going on in the text and in a conceptual worldview back then. The idea of jurisprudence came out, of course, Rome, and from a union of Ius and Prudentia, these two goddesses, and the those who officiated in what they did, in measuring the determination or the wisdom from these two goddesses, were considered priests. And so what came about is that the idea of jurisprudence, bringing these two terms together, came the idea of bidirectional synchronicity with the gods that you were working with, that you served. So the wisdom that you gave out could only come from the God that you served. And we don't have that kind of a concept in the word law. So that's why I'm using the word jurisprudence, because that's very much, if you take it in the idea of Torah, it's very much an idea of what's conveyed in the idea of Torah here. So jurisprudence is something that we can latch onto today as that which is an overriding discipline over what is law, governable, the methods behind it, the philosophies behind it, all these kinds of things that go into it. The idea of jurisprudence conveys that. Law is a category within that, though.
So I think, and to, I don't know, a certain extent, I've probably brought this up in the podcast before. So a thing in listening to some legal experts that I'll listen to on podcasts, and then some books that I've engaged with, I think there's been some capture around the understanding of law with regard to like textualism, and so whether you're talking about ancient kinds of law whether that's Roman or Torah, or even the English common law that we've kind of inherited to, I don't know, to a greater extent in this country than others. The textual, like purely textual understanding of law as the law is the text, rather than it's a participatory thing of citizens, we'll say, or adherents for something like Torah. Is that, I know that's kind of meandering and there's a lot of loose threads there. Is that kind of what you're talking about here?
I'm not sure I quite understand. Well, what I want to convey is that law is do or do not, right? We understand law is do or do not in general. What we have here, though, is a paradigmatic case that happens. So this is an event, and it is narratively described in this event with the context of an ordination and induction. All right, with the context of the Sinai, the entire they're in the domain of the Sinai right now, in the context of establishing nationhood that it has no land but will be receiving land. So in all of these kinds of, when you start moving out, what you see here is this is one paradigmatic um, illustration that's presented as a real case, but it's not considered case law. We don't. It's not really operating in that fashion. It's more of an illustration, but it has very paradigmatic poignancy to it. It's very important, which is why it's still within the eighth day. This is how serious we're to take the glory of Adonai, of Yahweh, right? This is how serious we're to take it. If the priests are culpable right then, this is how important it's got to be now. That's kind of the idea.
So in the transition from establishing, which is the first week,
Yes.
to now we're in the second week, we're in the execution or implementation phase, and day one of the implementation phase, things have already gone wrong. That's what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, it's actually in the eighth day. So this is like it's like the pre kickoff day because the ninth day hasn't happened yet. So this is where they get inducted and inaugurated, and they do their first official acts, quote unquote official acts, right? So this is still eighth day, not day one after the eighth day.
Okay. I can think of parallels, but I don't really want to throw throw them out there. It still does seem like there's a participatory element of law there. That,
Hmm.
but so I think the understanding that I particularly grew up with of law is that it is all just like it's this dictated thing, and like you said, do or do not. It seems like it might be more nuanced than even that, though. Is that fair to say?
Oh yeah, that's why I was using the word jurisprudence.
Oh, and so okay, so that's so I'm saying just getting a more expansive understanding of what law is beyond. So I kind of working back, and by this point, by the time this comes out, it will already be out. So discussing with Tzvi Novik his book Judaism: A Guide for Christians,
Hmm.
trying to get a positive frame of what Judaism is rather than the one that I grew up with. Maybe you did too. There was this thought process within evangelical Christian circles that I grew up in that Judaism was like, well, there was a plan that so that when you die you go to heaven, of like, will you obey all these rules? And so I wanted my questions to be at what is the positive assertion, and that's not what's happening here. Particularly in this story, there are priestly practices mandated by Adonai, and Aaron's sons deviated from what was mandated, and this is not like a larger spiritual understanding of what human conduct is supposed to be. This is about, hold on, let me scroll back up so I can get the language right. um I sanctify, hold on, as those near me I sanctify, so before all the people I am glorified.
Hmm.
And Aaron was silent. So that's kind of like, putting a bow on this thing, Adonai says, "This is my intent here," right?
Okay, but it's done in contrast to verses 23 and 24 in chapter 9. So what Nadab and Abihu did was wrong, and the threat to that was that since everyone had been atoned in this chapter 9, that atonement could be lost to all the people. And that's the threat. Okay, because these are the priest's sons, and these are the heirs. So what happened is that we see that the same fire that comes out from the tent of meeting, rather than consuming the sacrifice in verse 23 of chapter 9, it consumes Nadab and Abihu, thus thus maintaining the atonement of the people.
So, okay, I'm glad you brought up the fire. So you say fraudulent fire,
Mm-hmm.
and NRSV says unholy fire. I've heard strange fire.
Yep.
Um,
Alien fire, yeah.
how how important is that modifier? Sorry, that wasn't intended to be wordplay. Um, but
That's all right.
how important is the modifier there?
That modifier is not super, I would say it's not a crux. How you understand that is not a crux. But what I do find without really good explanation in the context, it can become a distraction of focus.
Okay.
So I think that the reader response to that is it's become, wait, what do you mean by strange fire? What's strange? What do you mean? And so all of a sudden the mind goes down the rabbit hole. This is actually how I started into this passage as a first was what was offered and what do you mean by strange? What do you mean by alien? And so that's why those choices of words, they actually don't they're not pivotal to the understanding. The problem is that as a reader response, they're very distracting in those kinds of words because it opens up all kinds of questions that we don't have to go down that trail on. But because that's where the mind goes. What do you mean by that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I know that I think connotation plays a lot in people's reading of words, and
Mm-hmm.
any of those modifiers are pretty strong. They
Mm-hmm.
have a pretty strong meaning to us when we come across them in English. So fraudulent does seem, I won't even say departure. It's a pretty bold stance.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea there is inauthentic, right? This fire is not the authentic fire intended for this
Mm-hmm.
particular sacrifice.
Which when you go through the various scholars who have written on this passage, you're going to find they all say that kind of an idea of it's inauthentic, if they shouldn't have done it, but then they translate it with these words of strange, alien, foreign, that kind of thing. And so, but it opens the reader's mind to question, well, what do you mean by that? Fraudulent, by bringing it overtly into the jurisprudence context of jurisprudence, the domain of violation, by using a word like that, it stops the questions. Well, what do you mean by fraudulent? You don't really ask that question. They just did what they shouldn't have done. The other ones are more exotic. It doesn't really state, well, should they have done it? Should they not have done it? Well, what is it? If it's strange, what do you mean by strange? You know what I mean? Is that clear?
Yes. So, okay, I'm going to try to equate this to an example that at
Okay.
least most Americans probably deal with once a week, if not more.
Okay.
When you're standing at the gas pump, there is a seal placed on the gas pump verifying that it meets the standards of weights and measures for your state. So in my example, my instance, state of Texas has sent someone out, and the numbers that are shown, you've pumped this many gallons and that equates to this price. My understanding is this seal authenticates that the state of Texas says this is accurate and that you are paying an accurate price for the amount of gas that you have pumped. If there were a seal other than that, based on the laws of the state of Texas, or in your case, the law of the state of Arizona, it would be fraudulent. It would not meet the legal requirements for me to rely on it. Now, I understand that is different. I'm talking about, this is my reliance, but it's my relationship with the state. And so ancient Israelites' relationship with the divinity and the priests acting as some kind of mediator in a ceremonial ritual, is that an apt analogy or comparison?
Yeah, I'd say so uh, because they did what they should not have done. You know, in the text, what they did was not commanded to do. So it's not like they were going against a verbal command. That would be like, you hear in movies and things like that, a drill sergeant, right? A drill sergeant telling talking to the private. One of the privates speaks up and he says, "Did I tell you to speak? Did I tell you to speak?" Of course, there's that setting. Well, he didn't. So the point is that he violated the conduct of the training period right now, because it was not a not commanded to speak. It was you don't speak until you're told to. So it's that kind of a scenario that's playing out. If you are not commanded to do so, remember in verse 8, in fact, all of Leviticus so far, all the specific practices of sacrificial practices in 1 to 7, including chapter 8, the first 7 days, in chapter 9, everything is do this, don't do this, wait till this time, be very specific. What is not stated is well, let me put it this way: no license is presumed to do whatever you feel like or whatever you want during this period.
And so they had actually, Adab and Abihu had encroached on someone else's responsibility. They were doing something that was supposed to happen in a different way, correct?
Yeah. So that was the actual offering was an Aaronic function, not for his sons. But we don't read that Aaron was supposed to do it at that time when they were to do it. It's not like they pushed Aaron aside to do it. We read what we read in the text. It's just that they took license to just do it.
Okay. And so you mentioned atonement. That's an interesting word. And I like talking about that word because that's another one that has a lot of theological connotations, particularly for Christians.
Mm-hmm.
So when you spoke about atonement earlier,
Mm-hmm.
what did you mean by that?
Well, in chapter 9, verse 7, we read that he made atonement for all the people. Aaron did. So that as part of the induction, that eighth day was to atone for everyone, including himself. And so that atonement means, of course, means absolving the guilt for all the people, including themselves, for the sins or the violations that they've done. And of course, as we know later on, that's a once-a-year practice. So this was the first one of the start of a once-a-year practice.
See, so I asked because I've been coming across, particularly, I'll plug my own podcast, David Moffat and Andrew Rillera so far, but then also I'll plug another podcast, the Jesus and the Jewish Law, I think it is. But they're talking about this understanding of atonement. Like there are two different conceptions of how the word atonement has been applied. So one in Hebrew Bible and one in the New Testament. And so one means reconciliation and the other one means removal. And I think they've gotten tangled up in the minds of a lot of Christians. Do you know what I'm talking? Like, am I just going off in a weird direction here with that?
Well, I do agree that in a lot of people, the words are confused. I think they're blended with other what I would say is other Christian terminologies like propitiation and things like that. That I think there's a blending that goes on, and a large part because they hear various snippets of systematic theologies, and then they kind of embrace parts of them, or parts of them stick. Parts of them stick, parts of it doesn't, and so I think that is an occurrence that goes on. Yeah.
So how could, in this case, I think I may be wording it incorrectly. The way you said it is that atonement could have been undone. Is that how you put it? With their actions here in 10:1-3, the atonement done in chapter 9 could have been undone. Is that how you said that?
Yeah, because in chapter 7, or I'm sorry, verse 7, we have at the end of 9, we have essentially the testimony of the Lord that he accepted all those things for the ninth day. Well, really for the eighth and for the ninth day. Sorry, seventh, like eighth, chapter 8, seventh day, and chapter 9, which is the start of the eighth day. He accepted everything, which included peace offerings and burnt offerings as well, and sin offerings, because we find that in verse 22, and wave offering in 21. And we see all of these other other offerings sprinkling around the altar that's being done. So this is a lot like the ordination ceremony, even though in verse 7 he offered that up. The confirmation of that offering is seen in verse 23 and 24, that Moses and Aaron goes to the tent of meeting, and the kavod of Yahweh came out and appeared to all the people. Fire came out from Adonai and consumed the burnt offerings and the sacrifices. So what happens right after that? Oh, and all the people fell on their faces. What happens right after that? It's Nadab and Abihu. Now, falling on your faces is a sign of wow. It can be a sign of mourning. It can be a sign of a number of these different things. Wow is what happened here. Nadab and Abihu then go offer a sacrifice in a way that contradicts the sacrifice that was offered previously in chapter 9. They're immediately killed by the fire from the Lord, from Adonai, which consumed them. Remember the contrast, that consumed all the sacrifices at the end of chapter 9, and they died before the Lord. Then we have that statement. It said, by those who come near me, I will be glorified. Right? I'm trying to remember how I translated that. As those near me I sanctify, so before all the people I am glorified. And what happened? Aaron is silent after that. There's the confirmation of that. So the thing is that what he did is he maintained by the glory of Yahweh appearing, the fire coming out from the tent of meeting. What we have is the maintenance of that atonement state. They didn't need to go through the atonement ceremony again, which we see in a large part of the chapter 9 and all those other sacrifices. They didn't have to go through and redo all those again because Nadab and Abihu messed it up.
The silence is kind of striking there. So what do you think we should infer from "and Aaron was silent"? Which I will add, you and the NRSV agree on. You
Yes.
both translate it that way.
And I'll say across the board, I'd say pretty much everyone agrees with that phrase. I will tell you, in part of my research into doing this, I was trying to I was looking at everyone and how they were using their punctuation. And I was seeing that, okay, should this be its own sentence? Should this be tied to the sentence before it in English? And when we translate it, And I said, no, this makes the most sense. What are we supposed to understand with that? By Aaron's silence, he is not contesting what just happened. It doesn't mean that he likes it. We're not to infer an emotional thing about this. This is, again, jurisprudence. We're to see that he accepts it. And I would imagine as a dad, that would be extremely difficult. But, sometimes when you've just been presented evidence, or we've just been presented evidence, sometimes your response is silence because the evidence is overwhelming. Right? this is kind of the idea here. It is the evidence is so overwhelming. He has no rebuttal. Therefore, that is full consent. Silence is also an aspect of mourning in Hebrew literature and the ancient Near East too. So to be silent is also a mourning feature, just as wailing is a mourning feature. So he had his head bowed by the people in the end of chapter 9, and you had in response to this, Aaron is silent. Now, interestingly, contrast that, though, with the end of chapter 10, when Aaron challenges Moses' accusation. So he wasn't silent then. He challenges and contests Moses' preliminary observation / suggestion of a coming judgment. And it is Aaron's forward defense in a very rational way that then Moses became silent. And it said, in English, it says when Moses heard the argument in verse 20, it says it seemed good in his sight. So the idea is Moses was silent and he consented, but with an affirmation. No, that's logical. That's a logical response. That makes sense.
I was wondering about the mourning aspect of this, but you're saying silence is an aspect of mourning culturally in Hebrew Bible. But this does kind of, I think, support your jurisprudential focus here of I think most readers are going to imply, and this just seems like a cross-cultural thing, Aaron would be at the very least sad. That seems like an understatement, but sad that his sons had just been had been killed.
Mm-hmm.
However, he is silent in the face of, like you said, in the face of evidence, and overwhelming evidence in this case.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's just it's such a stark punctuation to the end of this particular pericope. I like that word. I don't interact with that anywhere but this podcast, but in this
I'm sure you've heard it a lot.
in this pericope. And Aaron was silent. Yeah, and for it to be and you know what, I appreciate you kind of revealing that you were trying to make sure, like, is this the best way to say this as its own standalone sentence? And yeah, I don't know. I could bring up Bible Gateway and look at a number of translations, but I imagine they probably wouldn't disagree on that too much. Unless, have you found any that do kind of depart from that?
I'm going off of my memory since when I wrote this, and I don't think I found any that departed from this. And Aaron was silent. It seemed to be across the board, and I could be wrong, but my memory tells me that everyone regarded this the same in translation.
Okay, that's interesting, because I remember coming across I think it was the CEV years ago, John 11:35, and Jesus started crying, and I was like, well, that's that doesn't carry the same weight as Jesus wept. So there are even pretty well established verses that there will be disagreement on.
Oh yeah, like I think one of the biggest ones is in Ephesians, actually. In Ephesians, what is it, 4 or 3 through 15? Is that one sentence? Is it several sentences? How do you handle the in hymns, going from the end of the verse before it or the beginning of the verse after it? Is it a new sentence? There's a lot of questions, and this is why punctuation plays such a pivotal role. How you handle that. I mean, you've got to have answers for why a comma. What does a comma do to it? Why do you need it? Why an em dash? And here's the thing: is that all of these things, we live in a punctuated language now. All of these things are material towards understanding. In fact, I referenced an article in here by David S. Yellen. He deals with constitutional law. So I believe he's a lawyer, but his article was all about evaluating the punctuation of the Constitution. And he was very rigorous in his evaluation of the punctuation. And before that, I'm going off of my memory here, but British law before and after, British law did not use punctuation in their English. And before that, in the colonies, unless it was from Britain, I don't think there was punctuation except for in letters to each other. There was things like letters, but it was never in a law format. And so, but he even says, the punctuation can substantially change the entire meaning of a context. So it's very important.
Yeah, sometimes they'll have commas in a place that it's like, did you knock the comma shaker over? Did you just throw them in there? It seems like at random.
Mhm.
But then that kind of being a thing that I was referencing earlier, again, having grown up with the idea that the Constitution is the text of the document, I think may not really encapsulate the larger understanding of a constitutional order in the minds of people who had inherited a British common law system. The rights were not necessarily, like, if you look at it, there really aren't there really isn't a lot of discussion in the document of the Constitution about rights until you get to the amendments, and that was really more of a response on the part of the Anti-Federalists after the Constitution had been ratified. So, but if it functions more like a charter, and I think thinking about it in those terms, and then the rights are a thing that we're negotiating with one another. And if you look at legislation, at jurisprudence, but then also social and civil action on the part of citizens. So if you take all of that stuff, and that's just around our law that we're still practicing, and then you lay that a similar context over, quote, biblical law, which, I've had people on here who've said guidance might be a better word, but Torah is a thing that's different from the solely text-based understanding that we have. And I think this particular scene is interesting in that, like, how is this law? Well, it's a very dramatic scene. And I do like that you're willing to pivot and say, okay, to get away from law and the connotations and the preconceived notions that people have around that, I'm going to talk about jurisprudence. So I really appreciate that pivot on your part. All that rambling is to say thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Yeah, it's very kind.
What were you hoping I would ask about from the article that I have not brought up so far today?
You brought up a number of things that are, I think, very important, but I think it's more you gave an opportunity for me to emphasize something that I'm pretty passionate about, which is good. So it's not something that you didn't say, it's rather you gave me opportunity, and I really want to thank you for that, because I'm very, I have some, as I've been doing all this research, I have some pet peeves that have really come to the fore in translation. And one is the obsession, I'm using the word obsession, with the existential verb and the change of syntax. So like the verb to be. The verb to be in English is translated a lot. The ignoring, or rather, no, I should say the oversight, probably unintentional oversight of the importance of punctuation, and also I would say the words that are often overlooked ought to be carefully attended to in each context. So I think a lot of things that are done, it's to emphasize the speed to get to the main point that we want to get to. And like even in this article here, I was not able to do, from a space requirement by JBL, was not able to do something that I wanted to do, which was to bring in the textual criticism. The source documents, and to see about any variance and deviation there. I was not able to do that from a space standpoint, but that's something that I would like to get into. But I think that if we pay far more attention, less to the words that we're keen on, the verbs and the nouns, those kinds of things. But if we pay attention to the things that really don't hold our interest as much, we may find that materially affects our understanding of the words that we're attracted to.
Okay, so three things on that. It seems like that could be driven what you're addressing is like people are kind of focusing on certain things that could be driven by like preconceived notions
Hmm.
based on theology or based on the translations that they've already dealt with. I think I'm also wondering, is there a larger project that, like, have you conceived of a larger project that you could do that in? And then is there an overall scheme or interpretive method or a checklist, I don't know, that you would propose to people to, because I mean, it is a conflict to say, pay attention to the things that don't keep your interest. Like, how do you do that? So I know that's three things.
Okay.
Like, take them as you like.
All right. So first of all, yes, I have conceived of a larger project. I got to work the way up to it, though. Um, yes, I think there is a checklist that needs to be developed, and I've actually been working on it, but I'm going through some proof cases right now for it. Um, yes, there is preconceived notions and some underlying assumptions that go into reading any text. For example, well, this is the way it's always been. It's not my focus, so therefore it's okay. I mean, a lot of people. I will do this. When I was going through my dissertation, I had this assumption going in my head. My assumption was, okay, I'm focusing on this project I'm working on. This was not part of the dissertation at all, but I'm focusing on the dissertation product that which begs the question of these questions are underlying it, right? And so what I then did is like, okay, but surely that has been so well researched, that underlying question. And surely that has been so well researched because of that underlying question. So I don't need to really focus on those. And I just took it as a ticket for granted. I didn't need to focus on those. And when I started looking for sources for those underlying questions that I had that were part of my assumptions going into my dissertation, what I found is I couldn't find studies that had actually addressed that other question, that underlying assumption. I could not find people who had done that. So I think all of the scholars, they start off with a best intent, and we start off with the preconceived ideas. We have a questioning focus, and we start off by assuming, well, surely that's been well discussed and well researched out. Some of these other things, and I think that's a lot of it. So it's it's not about convenience. I think it really is a genuine belief that we have. Like, I wouldn't have gone down the road of evaluating a share if something didn't trigger in my mind. I was looking at this passage, I was looking at another passage too, and then just wrestling with this question. Well, of course, if people have studied a share. And then like I reference Robert D. Homestead. He's probably the most prolific a share scholar that we have today, and he's really researched into a share. He's done a great job on it, but he didn't address the questions that I'm dealing with here, and which was a surprise to me. That was how I even discovered him in the first place. And so you find out as you keep digging down, we generalize based on presumed authority or what we presumed has already been resolved, and we generalize and move on to get to the things that we're already focused on. And I think that is an aspect of human condition. And I think what we need to do is slow down and really just go back to the basics. And let's just start and let's just be careful and go through each step all along the way. Let's not assume punctuation, because I saw some other passages I've been working on. I've been working on Leviticus 10:8-11. And I can't tell you how many different kinds of punctuation patterns I've seen in there, breaking it up into several different, up to 4 sentences, I think. And people have that as one sentence. There's semicolons, there's em dashes, there's commas, there's changing of syntax, there's all kinds of things going on. And I don't think that there's not any maliciousness there. I think it's just starting off with preconceived ideas and not really challenging your underlying assumptions before you actually go in and start evaluating the text. And I think that that's what we got to deal with, is really being very, very careful with our underlying assumptions when we approach a text, just because we want to get to the main reason why we went to that text in the first place. I hope that clears that up.
No, that does. That's really helpful. And I hope as you're working on checklist, I guess we're going, whatever checklist you're working on, maybe that can make its way into some kind of a more popular level thing, because there
Mm-hmm.
are people who are engaging with biblical texts all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and there's not a whole lot of discipline, and there's a whole lot of talking
Mm-hmm.
out there. And so I don't know. I hope for a lot of people they can benefit from something like that without having to go through a dissertation process.
Yeah.
Because
Well, there there
that's
is
long.
there is a lot of there are a lot of books on various types of cognitive grammar, various kinds of grammar studies. Um, there are syntax studies that are out there. I mean, there are people that are touching the space. I don't find anything on punctuation. You know,
Well,
I don't find anything on punctuation in biblical studies. It is so rare, and it's usually like a caveat to an article, as opposed to a thesis of a book, for example. You know, and yet that is so important for meaning development in English language. And so the effect on that means that we go into this presuming, well, everyone would understand this anyway because it's just punctuation, and there's not a lot of thought put into why is this punctuation necessary here? What is it conveying apart from that? I don't find really anything that discusses that.
I wonder if that's because it seems arcane, or if because there are those presumptions, or both, or all of them in something else.
Yeah, I think it's all of them and something else. I think there's a lot. I don't think it's a one simple causation.
I wish it
I,
were.
I, yeah, I think it'd be easy to address then. Um, yeah, I think there are market dynamics which continue the same. You know, speed of publication, um, delimitation of how much a publication can how many words can be in a publication, the economic factors, how much you're supposed to publish. All of these are external stimuli upon scholars out there. Then you have the internal stimuli, which is I have these assumptions under note. I don't even have the time because of these other objectives to drill down in, and yet I got to get something published under contract. So I think there's a lot of things that go into play on this issue. But I think through this article, I think what you find is that by attending to the mundane and the boring, I think what you find is a much more urgent and pristine text may arise from that. You know, and in this particular case, how it fits in with the context, it seems to fit in better with the jurisprudential theme with this translation. I mean, of course, I wrote it, so that's my perspective.
Yeah, well,
But
I'm glad you have a favorable opinion of what you wrote.
right.
I would be concerned if you didn't.
So I think it's very important because, in fact, even at the end of verse 3, that is notoriously difficult verse to translate. What God says is, "Those near me I sanctify, so before all the people I am glorified." But without attending to the who, and the asher in the preceding clause, you can't deal with how to render that that clause or that saying by God, that proverb. You can't attend to it. So the who and the asher in verse 3, how you translate that materially changes the entire two clauses that come after that in that phrase. It materially changes it. And so it's not just you look at these words in isolation. You have to look at these words in their context, in the flow of their narration. or poetics, of course, depending on the context. You have to look at it in its flow, in its milieu, while doing your best to separate how we process information today, not just English. I'm talking about in the contemporary milieus that we have, and to get that into a form that would have been likely understandable and make fidelity to the original context to your best ability. Knowing that, of course, at the same time, you can't do the one-to-one. You're going to have limitations.
So I think that's a good segue into what would you recommend for listeners to read, listen to, watch, whatever, to get a better understanding of these divides that when you engage with a biblical text. How do you bridge that divide the best you can?
Two things. One, I would say, neither of these actually has to do with reading the Bible right now, reading the Hebrew text. The first thing I would say is understand how they thought back then. So that would be the first thing. Understand their milieu, their intellectual, their ethical milieu. Really strive to understand how they thought, what was the limits of how they thought. Because it is so different from our post-Copernicus world. So different. And what we view, our moral compass, is totally different than their moral compass. Our ethical confinements are morally different, are substantively different than what theirs were. So we have to understand that. Secondly, I would really delve very heavily into coherent reasoning and critical thinking. Just really ask questions about yourself, understand what critical thinking is all about, really become an optimistic skeptic, and really learn to separate yourself from your own thought. In other words, metacognition. Develop metacognition, the ability to evaluate yourself about the process you go through and how you think. I would say start these two so understand theirs. We already know where we're at, even if we don't process it. But you got to create the separation. You got to understand this is how they could think back then. This was what was important to them and how they reasoned. Now understand how you reason, how you think, and start challenging yourself. I think these two things are perhaps the most important. Then go look into the text and just ask questions of it, and be willing to challenge anything, absolutely anything. Challenge whatever you see. Challenge the flow. Challenge the meaning. Challenge the words. Challenge the punctuation. Challenge the versification. Challenge the chapter. But if you don't do these two things first, then you're always going to go in bringing you're going to bring anachronistic ideas into how you read the English translation of the Bible. That's inevitable. And then furthermore, you're going to bring these anachronistics because you don't know what was thinkable back then. You won't even know. So you will be retrojecting and anachronistic ideas onto there. And then secondly, if you don't even know how to ask questions of yourself, then how can you really honestly answer questions about that text? Because then that does relate to you. Not only as a matter of faith, but that relates to you as a matter of practice. And it relates to you in how you can identify with back then. And by the way, it's no different from if I was to go from here to England. I have to be able to separate myself to understand them. Otherwise, I'm an alien pointing the finger in judgment, usually.
I mean, that sounds pretty American.
Yeah, but that's wrong. Totally wrong. It doesn't matter where you go. The culture over there, time is not the issue in that one, but it is a different culture, and how they value things and how they They measure things, it's equally valid. I have to have the eyes to be able to see the validity of those things. So I've got to be able to understand how I reason and how I think.
Is there a good introduction that you would recommend to that cultural milieu of the construction of the Hebrew Bible?
Oh, yeah, John Walton, Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament.
Okay, I think that one may be behind me, actually.
That is an excellent one.
Okay, cool. Are there others? Is there one that you would? Your emphasis is on Hebrew Bible, but are there any for New Testament era, just in case?
Well, first of all, I'd still say this is still valid for the New Testament. You need this for the New Testament as well. They're
Okay,
they're going to have some nuanced differences, of course, because they don't really emphasize Greek culture or Roman culture. But you're going to have understand the they're going to have everything in there plus the Greek and Roman culture. So that's a good one. Another good one is actually by Talilan, Jewish Women in Greco-Roman Palestine. Now that focuses on women. That's a really good resource. Another good resource, this is actually regarding gender, From Her Cradle to the Grave by Carl van der Toorn. That one's a really good one. Really good one.
nice. Okay,
Uh, another really good one is by Hans Walter Wolff, Anthropology of the Old Testament. That's a classic now. That's a really good one.
cool. Okay, thanks for those.
Yeah.
What do you read for fun?
What do I read for fun?
Yeah.
uh, what do I read for fun? Well, when I get some, mostly I don't read, do pleasure reading that much anymore in that sense. I enjoy reading other books by other scholars. It's just that's become more fun to me. Um, but if I'm looking for a novel, uh, Louis L'Amour is probably my favorite. So he's one of my
Okay.
favorites. That's
The
just
westerns.
the West. Well, his style of Western.
Okay.
Yeah, so I like his style. Yeah.
Well,
So
what do you do? What do you do to decompress? I don't want to pigeonhole you
sure.
into. Yeah, and if you read other scholars for fun, that's what you do. That's what you read for fun. But what do
Yeah.
you do to decompress other than read?
Okay, to decompress. Well, see, I was doing rock climbing with my son a lot, so I enjoy that. Um, yeah, I enjoy spending time with my family. I'm more of a family guy, so I like being with my family. We like to go on lots of trips. So, I mean, I'd say it's probably more family time. And that's
Okay.
just, it's just something I enjoy. He and I do some, physical things like rock climbing together, or we might do some workouts together. Um, so that's fun.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good answer. That's your answer. Well, what? Okay. What's the last other scholar that you read that you were like, oh man, this is really exciting.
Okay, the most recent one is actually Mark Lester, Deuteronomy and the Material Transmission of Tradition. It's it just came out, and I did a review of it. It's really, I was very surprised at how good it is. But what he does is he evaluates the Deuteronomistic text. This is a picture of it right here. The Deuteronomistic text, but he does it from the standpoint of political iconography. So if iconography was the means of the day of communicating law, sovereignty, boundaries, these kinds of things, and we look at the stelas, for example, like Ezra Haddon, that kind of thing. If we look at that now, look at the text of Deuteronomy as a literary version of a stela. What can we learn from that? And so his insights were really, really good, as he just compares the iconographic approach to the Assyrian rulers, for example, like Ezra Haddon and Sennacherib, and compares that with Deuteronomy and how Deuteronomy is written. Very, very interesting, including what is the visual. perception of it, just the fact of it being physically present, as opposed to an abstract, a text with words on it. It's physical structure. It is about yay high, that kind of thing. So he really goes through all of that. It was really a well done book, very well done.
Yeah, that one's been on my radar, but I've gotten out over my skis and I have too many books to read, so I have to take a break to catch up. But yeah, I follow him, I think, on Twitter or something, and
Oh.
so yeah, at some point I'll probably try to read that one because it does sound really interesting. Ryan Chester, thank you so much for being here. Unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
That sounds really good. No, I've really appreciated it, Jared. Thank you for your time, and thank you for doing this too. I think it's really good forum for other people to hear what other people in the industry are doing, in biblical studies, and what are they doing, and what are they researching on. So I think it's a really good forum that you've developed here. So thank you for that.
Well, I really appreciate it. Look, it's a joy. It's a pleasure. I like doing this. I like meeting you guys and talking about what you do. So I definitely benefit from it, and I get to work through my personal stuff. But if I get to expose people to your work, like, that's a super big bonus. So thanks so much again. And I really want, if there's a larger project that comes out of this, I really hope you come back and talk to me about that.
That sounds great. I look
All right,
forward.
man.
You take care now. Thank you.
Likewise. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Once again, thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe, like, comment, send me emails at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Or become a supporter on Patreon for $5 a month. Next week on the podcast, guest is Brad Kelly. If you are interested in trauma, you came to the right place because I have quite a few episodes on trauma. As I'm sitting here, my interview with Sarah Emanuel was just released this past week for free. But this is a conversation with Brad Kelly about his Journal of Biblical Literature article, Is Hosea Also Among the Traumatized? The Book of Hosea and Trauma Hermeneutics. He utilizes Sarah Emanuel's work and Alexiana Fry's work. And yeah, there's a lot of overlap, a lot of people pulling from one another in this arena of using trauma theory as a means of reading biblical texts. I'm recording this conclusion, this outro, 14 September. And just a few days ago, there was a very public assassination of a political commentator. And that same day, there was a school shooting. It's not the bloodiest day in American history, and it doesn't have to be the bloodiest day in American history to be traumatic. I hope that we in the United States can find it within ourselves to build a narrative that will help us to deal with what we are doing to ourselves. Coincidentally, the same day that Charlie Kirk was murdered, on a cable news morning show, the subject of homelessness came up, and one of the hosts said that if the mentally ill or drug addicted homeless population won't take help, maybe they should go to jail. And another suggested maybe they should be euthanized. I'm taking this moment to run the risk of being called an alarmist, to acknowledge that that point was made. Because the next time something like that comes up, as the trends indicate, when someone suggests something that grotesque, and I do mean either of those proposals, it's too late. you missed the chance to say something. There are interviews that I've already recorded that I have yet to edit or publish that I think will be a helpful framing for how I want to comment on things like that. But I'd like to point out that the problem of homelessness is not the presence of homeless people. The presence of homeless people is a symptom of the real problems. I think the attempt to attribute to ultimate causes is pretty common in this country with regard to gun violence, because when there is a mass killing, which there is much too often, the response to an attempt to centralize firearms is to say, well, the guns aren't the problem, and the culprit is usually mental illness. And there is rarely, so far as I can tell, any actual solution proposed in response to that ultimate problem. Which leads me to believe that pointing to an ultimate problem in that case is not so much to zoom out and see beyond the proximate cause of the carnage, but is to distract away from any meaningful conversation at all. That's not what I'm doing here. I am saying, when I say at the end of the episodes, if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. What I'm saying is, where we see the opportunity with drug addicted or mentally ill people or anyone else who's living on the street, engaging with that person, whether as an individual, a local or municipal community, a state or federal, or even globally, engaging with that person, I think, means providing them with what they need. And if what they need is shelter, clothing, water, food, and mental health care, then those are things that we should look to provide. They need help, and we have a responsibility to give it to them. And so with that, I will say, I think this is a helpful segue into what Brad Kelly has to say in this short introduction. If you want to hear it, you can join as a member on Patreon for $5 a month. There's a link in the show notes, and you can hear this interview now. If you get a chance to love someone, please take it. Take care.
Big shout out to Kathleen O'Connor, and her work on Jeremiah early on was one of the first places that this stuff was kind of coming in. And her starting point in her book, Jeremiah, Pain and Promise, she kept encountering students in a seminary setting who said, I can't read the book of Jeremiah. It's too violent. The portrayals of God are awful. Even the prophet is, it's just, I can't read it. Like, and I can't do anything with it. Like, what am I supposed to do? Preach from this? Whatever. And that's what basically led her to a trauma interpretation of the book of Jeremiah, saying, what if you flip it around and start to read the stuff you're seeing in there, the metaphors and images of violence and talking about God, as these are expressions of traumatic experiences that actually Jeremiah and Jeremiah's community are having. And they talk about God being violent because that's what they've experienced. They've experienced violence. And this is a way, somehow, some way. And I'd say this about Hosea too. When you read Hosea saying God's doing this and God's doing that, it's easy for us to look at that and go, what kind of stupid, ancient, educated theology is that? Unless you're Jerry Falwell, who then loves that theology. But what we may not realize is, as bad as that is, and as much as we wouldn't want to take that and just run with it, it's an attempt to make sense out of trauma in desperation. Because it wasn't God who did those things, that it was the Assyrian emperor. But if you say it's the Assyrian emperor who did it, the Assyrian emperor has all the power. I mean, this is an effort to say, you know what? Screw the Assyrian empire. This was our God who did this to us. And if it wasn't the emperor, but it was our God, therefore maybe there's some hope that things could be different. Like, we can persuade our God to be differently toward. So as bad as that is on the surface, and we might not want to just use it as is, I think it gives us a little bit of recognition that these are attempts, these are grasps for making some kind of meaning out of trauma. And even if we don't do exactly what they did, which we probably shouldn't do, all those moves, it teaches us kinds of things that we ought to do, or at least be aware of.